Okay, thank you so much, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here, both in this group and talking with my friend Sai. It's always a great joy to discuss these things with Sai, partly because this is how I wish all political debates were, the debates I have with Sai. They were serious, measured, smart, and exclusively featuring Jews from the international socialist tradition. Which may sound like a sectarian comment, but actually it's not, because that includes Kidron as well as Cliff, so it's very broad. Okay, so I'm delighted to be here, and I'm going to start with Donald Trump, and I'm going to end with the Daily Telegraph, and in between I'm going to cover some things that might be even less nice. So I want to start with, I'm going to be, the kind of division of labor we've agreed is that I'm going to be talking about what subaltern anti-Semitism is today as I see it, and Sai's going to be talking about this other half of the picture that I've also written about and that he's written about better than I have, which is the question of the place of the state and contemporary philo-Semitism as anti-Semitism. The kind of structural anti-Semitism of our epoch. So I want to start with Trump's final ad of the 2017 US presidential campaign. If you were sat watching Hillary Clinton's final ad and Trump's final ad, it was difficult to predict, and yet so many did, any result other than the one that actually transpired. Clinton spoke as if from in front of a kind of halo, dressed all in white, and she spoke about how lovely it would be if people could come together and love each other. Trump, on the other hand, gave this furious, hard-hitting message about the decline of America and its brutalization by people he called the establishment. And that word establishment, or perhaps elites, occurred several times in the course of this short advert. Frequently, when that word was mentioned, a face appeared on the screen, which would be a face like George Soros or Lloyd Blankfein from Goldman Sachs. Frequently, these faces were Jewish. And this was the image of the establishment and of elites. So what's specific about this right-wing anti-elitism? I think one impulse on the left is a bit too cocky and too sure of itself in our present moment. And that is to say that a right-wing anti-elitism can't really deliver because the real elites are structurally ingrained in, produced by capitalist social relations, and the right obviously doesn't want to challenge them. And so right-wing anti-elitisms that claim that, say, there's just a narrow ethnically constituted cancer, like a group of Jews that just have to be zapped, and the structure of social relations is fine, they can't really deliver the promise of transforming society and making it more comfortable for people who understand themselves as being subaltern to live in that society. I think the mistake here is to take insufficiently seriously the people who are watching that Trump ad and cheering him on and are chanting, "Drain the swamp." I think the point is not that they want structural social transformation, something like social revolution, and that Trump actually can't deliver it to them because while he claims to want to drain the swamp, he's really just another New York billionaire. The point is that, that this is an epoch that has given up on the possibility of structural social transformation, that thinks, in fact, that the very project of structural social transformation is just going to bring more violence and horror and lead to the gulag. And if you're in that kind of place, then the best you can do in a world in which you can't actually get rid of billionaires is to find a billionaire who seems to piss off the other billionaires, where draining the swamp doesn't actually mean, I hope that Trump is going to get rid of capital, and then you're disappointed when he doesn't. It just means, I hope he's going to offend all the people that I really loathe. So it's a dramatically less radical claim that is attached to right-wing anti-elitism, which is why Trump supporters who say that he's going to make America great again can seem enthusiastic about him after 4 years. And in this last election, he still, he increased his vote, even though he doesn't carry out the kind of dramatic changes that some sneering voices on the left suggested he would surely fail to do in 2016, and would therefore, they predicted, disappoint his supporters. So I want to start from this sort of moderate conservative aspiration of right-wing anti-elitism at a moment of loss of hope in the left, because the way that I think about contemporary anti-Semitism comes out of the fact that my PhD research is about the decline of thinking about the end of capitalism, and that's the context in which I read it. So just to set out quickly the 3 dates that I take in the argument I make about contemporary anti-Semitism as key to its contemporary formation: 1989, 9/11, and 2008. 1989, the moment of the end of history. I don't actually think it was a sudden moment. I don't think that in 1987 and 88, millions of people believed in ending capitalism and then suddenly stopped when the Berlin Wall came down. I come, as do others on this call, from a political tradition that has questions about whether the Berlin Wall coming down was really such an awful thing. But 1989 comes to be remembered as this moment of Francis Fukuyama's end of history, the impossibility of social revolution. In that then just heralded kind of peace and prosperity, the lack of really antagonistic politics. We were to be governed instead by questions of mere administration, you know, as Saint-Simon had it much, much longer ago. 9/11 and its aftermath punctured in quite a relieving way, I think, for much of Western society, allowed for a kind of return of the repressed in terms of puncturing the illusion of that post-political world. Because what you discovered after 9/11 was that you could have your fundamental political antagonisms again, as long as they were cultural rather than about social relations. Burghers facing off against Burkers, Huntington's Clash of Civilizations displaces Fukuyama's End of History as the main sort of narrative arc of the age from the right and center. And then in 2008, of course, the economy resurged as a focus of politics where we needed answers. And which was concerning people. And just as in 9/11, it had been discovered that we didn't need to have a post-political age, people started grasping against the idea that we had a post-economic crisis age. You know, Gordon Brown said he'd abolished boom and bust, that the economy was no longer a central political question. And in that moment, in which people are looking for a way of expressing economic antagonisms, where structural social transformation has been ruled out as impossible, and where the dominant language for thinking about politics has become cultural and racial, the language of the clash of civilizations, of British values in this country, and the prevent agenda as a key dividing line in our politics. Do you have British values or not? In that moment, I think anti-Semitism is extremely potent as a language of political culturalism fitted to economic anxieties. If Islamophobia expresses in cultural terms your anxieties about your physical safety, your geopolitical security, anti-Semitism expresses in cultural terms your anxieties about your job, about your prosperity. It says there's this cultural other, which is not the jihadi terrorist who's going to bomb your supermarket, but is the Jewish banker who's going to put you out of a job. So that is how I read contemporary anti-Semitism, starting from an insistence that we need a left-wing theory of contemporary anti-Semitism markedly different from the right-wing theory of the so-called new anti-Semitism, which would simply blame the wretched of the earth, the left, Palestinians, Muslims especially, as villains attacking Jews who become, in this view, the kind of ultimate image of bourgeois society. And Sai's written, I think, interestingly about that. So on this view of anti-Semitism, rather than it being the left, which is the great harbinger of anti-Semitic thinking everywhere, we start to see how all kinds of forms of thought that render supposed anti-elitism in the terms of cultural conspiracies are the kinds of harbingers of anti-Semitism. For example, the liberal obsession in Britain, but especially in America, with the idea of Russian conspiracies being behind everything that's wrong. You know, so you avoid thinking about the fundamental problems in your society by saying America didn't vote for Trump because it has fundamental anxieties, but because there were some hackers, this tiny conspiracy who sort of, the same with the Brexit vote, who wrecked it. That is a structure of thought, just like the anti-Semitic structure. Likewise, Boris Johnson had a mayoral ad against, funnily enough, Ken Livingstone, in which Ken is sat there in a smoky, dark room with a group of union barons and lefties smoking Fidel Castro's Cuban cigars, and they're divvying up London, they're dividing up control over London. Ken and the secretive cabal, the protocols of the elders of Ken Livingstone. And that again is a structure of thinking which is a small, shadowy conspiracy, dislocated from the structure of social power. These are not capitalists, right? This is a shadowy conspiracy which is separate from the realities of social power in a capitalist society, like union barons or Russian hackers or lizards or Jews or whatever it is. These are the structures of thinking to which anti-Semitism is akin. Conspiracy theories about Freemasons would be a traditional kind of analog, I think. Again, all very different from a left-wing politics that wants to think about social structures rather than simply more easily vanquished conspiracies. Okay, why is that a problem? Well, the global survey evidence suggests quite clearly that there is a steady, serious level of anti-Semitic thinking, which is significantly lower around the world and in Britain than, for example, Islamophobic thinking. It also suggests that while the level of anti-Semitic thought remains quite constant over the last 10 or 15 years, even 20 years really, the level of anti-Semitic harassment and violence is on the rise quite steadily. And so I think one of the problems with surveys that just ask, do you hate Jews, is they ask, you know, what do you think of Jews, and also, do you want to lose weight? And you might both want to lose weight and not like Jews very much, but the important thing is not just what you think about those things, but how much relative importance you give them. And what's happened in the last 2 years is that perhaps that do you hate Jews questions become more important in people's minds as they search for antagonistic frames through which to think about their lives in the aftermath of 2008 crisis, I think. So it isn't even just that anti-Semitic attitudes have increased, it's that their prominence in people's minds, I think, has increased. So why is it a problem? Well, there are three ways, I think, implicitly on the left, but sometimes explicitly. Norman Finkelstein has written some stuff making this explicit. Jamie Stern-Wiener also has. Three ways of kind of downgrading the importance of this as a problem, right? One is to say it's much less of a problem clearly than other forms of bigotry, which I think is obviously true. The other thing is to say that Jews are not as unsafe in Western society today in places like Britain as, say, Muslims, which again I think is obviously true. And there is an agenda to attack the left which would deny these things, right, which would claim absurdly that, you know, Jews in Britain are less safe or less cared about. You know, the idea that like everyone cares about racism against black people, but no one cares about anti-Semitism is sort of obviously not only untrue, but deeply, deeply offensive. And then the third reply is to say, well, actually, some of the claims made by anti-Semitism, Norman Finkelstein has said this, are even empirically true today. You know, anti-Semites complain about Jewish wealth and power. Well, there are lots of rich Jews. And I think these things miss the point. I mean, you know, that's analogous, of course, to right-wingers saying, have you seen the statistics about black crime? The point about racism is not whether they say things that happen to be true, but about the way that they interpret those truths as cultural problems rather than socially caused problems. But these things miss the point, because the problem of anti-Semitism, like the problem of all bigotries, for Marxists, is to ask what social functions they serve in the reproduction of class society. And different bigotries hold different social functions. This isn't to say they're deliberately necessarily authored to have those functions, but they come to take them on. And so Islamophobia might have a particular function in legitimating imperial wars abroad, for example. Anti-Semitism, it seems to me, has a different and very, very potent function, which is that it directs anti-elitist sentiments into avenues that are not fundamentally challenging to class society. Now, I don't say it comes along, as it might have done in the 1930s. This is the distinctness of our moment. I don't say it comes along in a moment of revolutionary politics and diffuses that revolutionary politics by making people who would otherwise be socialist anti-Semites. No, I think the problem of our moment is that the possibility of anti-Semitism speaks to the fundamental crisis of a more radical, emancipatory, anti-systemic politics. That is, it is precisely because you don't think that you can storm the Winter Palace that the most you can do now is drain the swamp by electing a billionaire who's going to offend George Soros. So I don't say it's a kind of cunning ruling class ploy to diffuse left-wing anti-elitism. I say it's a thing that arises precisely in a moment where left-wing anti-elitism feels impossible. And that's the crisis, our deep crisis, it seems to me, for the left, that the rise of anti-Semitism attends to, witnesses, demonstrates, evidences, and that we have to think about. But this is to say that anti-Semitism then presents a problem for all of us. You know, it may be that Sai and I became interested in this thing because our, you know, being Jewish is important to us. But actually, the if anti-Semitism is a problem for this reason, for its broad social function in displacing more radical anti-elitisms, emancipatory forms of politics, then we are completely led astray by a contemporary anti-racism that sees a language of solidarity replaced by a language of allyship. That is to say, the problem with racism is that it targets particular groups and those groups are hurt by it. It's to move from a language of oppression, as I saw my friend Jacob Bard-Rosenberg saying today, to a language of persecution, right? In which X group is targeted, they experience the problem, and therefore they transparently can understand the problem, and you simply have to ask them what they think about the problem. So in today's discourse of anti-Semitism, you know, we have to ask what Jews think. We have accepted community bodies like the Board of Deputies of British Jews that can translate and speak for what Jews think. And the dominant left-wing response is to say, no, but I'm a left-wing Jew and the Board of Deputies don't represent me. You are delegitimizing the existence of left-wing Jews. And that I don't think is actually the right response. You know, it serves its role, it's fine. But that's still to operate within a logic where the problem of racism is that a particular community is targeted and we have to ask the community how they feel about it, rather than it serving and this is what the language of solidarity across all of us, of black and white unite and fight, once tried to do, to say these are problems for all of us. They serve social functions which are damaging for all of us. And so I think we have to get completely out of a framing which is a dominant across much of the left, not just in the case of anti-Semitism, which has forgotten that that attempt to ask what role ideology serves in the reproduction of social relations, and instead treats ideology only as a question of persecution of a narrow and particular group. I will just say, do I need to wrap up there, Jace? Or can I say a couple more things? I'm shit at timing.
Yeah, I think maybe a couple more.
I should wrap up there. Okay, can I one more thing?
Oh, no.
I'm fine.
Yeah, more things, yeah.
Okay, so So if this problem, if this stress on lived experience, which is a central category in Fanon and in de Beauvoir, has a long 20th century history in emancipatory politics, but was treated very, very differently from how it's treated now, as a purely transparent measure of the opinions of a certain thing called, historically constructed but externalized, essentialized thing called a community, right? It was once treated much more critically and historically. If that sort of fetish on lived experience is part of our problem in engaging the reality of anti-Semitism as a broader social problem from the left, a social problem for the whole of the social totality. I think another problem of the transformation of anti-racism, another equally kind of liberal move ultimately, is the construction of a thing called a reasonable public sphere, where racism is understood as the problem of a few bigots who stand outside that reasonable public sphere. And if you understand both the construction of the reasonable public sphere and the construction of lived experience as a mechanism for removing the possibility of treating racism as a problem of the social totality and treating it instead as marginal problem, basically it becomes a problem of a few evil people targeting a few other people, rather than a problem in the reproduction of a whole society and the social needs that society has, which generates these bigotries, right? Then you see how so much of the contemporary panic has been generated by these two problems. So we must ask what the Board of Deputies says in order to know what to do about anti-Semitism. That's clearly this kind of lived experience stuff. And we must generate quasi-legal definitions which can exclude individual bigots who are anti-Semites, so that one anti-Semite in the Labour Party is one too many, as Jeremy Corbyn says. This, of course, reproduces the idea of bigotry as being this marginal thing, and the ability to think about it as structural, as generated by a set of social conditions, and therefore giving you an ideological frame that serves to affect the thinking of all of those supercilious centrists who obsess about Russian conspiracies. The possibility of seeing that as part of an ideological frame that has something in common with anti-Semitism is completely occluded by the will to make it a problem of fringe bigots, whether they're on the far right or the far left. The Equality and Human Rights Commission investigates the BNP and investigates Corbynites in the Labour Party, these weird extremists who have to be expunged from the reasonable public sphere. I have much to say, but I won't, about the moral panic that I think has become associated with this contemporary anti-Semitism. But I trust Sai to talk a bit about that. All I will say is on that I think if you have an understanding of bigotries as ideological, as structures of feeling generated by particular kinds of social conditions, then you can also understand the panicked ways of responding to them in similar terms. And that removes from you the kind of wishful thinking that says, this is a campaign by a few people, and if only we had some better kind of PR response, as is a tendency often on the left, if only Corbyn had a smarter response, then we could have made this thing go away. Just as I think anti-Semitism is a kind of panic, a rising panic, a way of articulating anti-systemic, ostensibly anti-systemic feeling in an age defined by culturalism after the War on Terror and the end of history after 1989. And so it serves broad social needs, and that's why it will recur, not just because there are a few bad apples. Marxism is a theory not of the bad apples, but of the barrel, right? In the same way, the panic about anti-Semitism is a broad panic, I think, about the return of antagonistic politics, this reading of the new anti-Semitism, in which anti-Semitism is the kind of dark shadow lurking behind all attempts to speak again about power and wealth. And on that reading, neoliberal technocrats with a lot of post-colonial anxieties get to read the wretched of the earth, this invading force, as a terror, while articulating their fears as progressive and multicultural anti-racist, because you don't fear Palestinians and radical leftists because they want to tear down Western society anymore. You fear them because they're a threat to Jews, your sort of protected minority. So you articulate your fears about the instability of technocratic neoliberalism in supposedly progressive multicultural terms. That social need, I think, can't be got rid of just by some better PR decisions from Jeremy Corbyn, which was often a tendency on the left, which I think massively underestimated the scale of this concern. So I'll finish with a recent letter in the Daily Telegraph, which was valuable for iterating once again a kind of right-wing anti-Semitism that has been less common in discussions of the phenomenon over recent years. This was a letter published by a group featuring 59 Tory MPs who signed up to the Common Sense Group. And the Common Sense Group opposed the idea that we should have historically accurate discussions of the role of slavery in Britain's past. And they opposed that by saying that it was cultural Marxist dogma, which came from bourgeois liberals and a powerful clique who they said had taken control of our society. This is, again, as ideology so often does, without using the language, without saying these bourgeois liberals are, by the way, rootless cosmopolitans and I mean Jews. This is precisely to have the ideological framing that was central to 1930s fascism, to Hitler, for example, and to much of American reaction in reaction to the civil rights movement, for example, which was to say there's this small clique of rootless cosmopolitans not loyal to the nation form. They have the money and the resources and the wisdom, but they don't have the numbers to tear down the nation form. So they get the blacks in the civil rights movement, for example, to tear down white society, and it's a Jewish organized campaign. And so the reason that's very important, I think, and helpful to us is in that case, the kind of conservatism of anti-elitism, of nominal anti-elitism was very clear. Not all anti-elitism, not all politics that claims to punch up is radical. Here, an attempt to get white working class people to hate George Soros is not about emancipating anyone, but is about telling them that this billionaire threatens the traditional hierarchies of Western society in alliance with Black Lives Matter. And so in the case of anti-Semitism explicitly on the right, the conservative dynamic of anti-Semitism is totally open and clear. The argument I want to make is that in the case of anti-Semitism that can appear on the left, it still has that conservative dynamic. It's still about reassuringly telling you that only a small cabal is responsible for your problems, not the whole structure of social relations. But because it claims to punch up in a more serious way, the conservative function of that is missed not only by the people who endorse it, but also by the contemporary right-wing moral panic, which would treat anti-Semitism as a problem of excessive radicalism, when in fact we on the left should say it's a problem of excessive moderation, and it poses a challenge to us about the difficulty of spreading a genuinely emancipatory politics in our moment, and it's in the crisis of that radicalism that people turn to answers like anti-Semitism.
Thanks, Barnaby. Yeah, thank you. Sai, do you want to respond or?
Thanks a lot for inviting me to be part of this discussion and to get to talk about these things with Barnaby, which is always a pleasure, but not more than being called both serious and measured in his first 30 seconds, which I have to say, to describe my intervention. So that was already a nice surprise. I guess my approach to thinking through the question of anti-Semitism today has been slightly different to Barnaby's, and I guess my focus, or what I think is important to get our head around, is how the position of Jews in Western society, the particular way in which Jews have been collectively positioned by in the narrative about where they stand in Western civilization, I think is fundamentally different from the kind of traditional ways we are used to think about it. And certainly I think within the Marxist tradition, the kind of theoretical work that we have on the so-called Jewish question, etc., I think tells us fairly little about the position that Jews are made to occupy today, and isn't particularly helpful, and so it needs to be rethought. And it also seems to me that we are in the debates around anti-Semitism in a particularly odd situation, which is that on the one hand, we have a new rise of the far right across the board, a rise of racism and a rise of anti-Semitism within that. The data is pretty clear that the amount of anti-Semitic attacks grow year in, year out. By the way, one of the things that's remarkable is that all the data, including by Jewish organizations, points to the fact that these attacks are overwhelmingly committed by the far right. And yet all of these reports start with an introduction that discusses the left in Britain, the Labour Party, Corbyn, etc., for about 2 pages before showing data. So the CST data is incredible in that sense, is that the data shows one thing and the introduction kind of shows the opposite. And that kind of captures, I think, the weird position we're in, is that on the one hand, with the rise of reaction in the right, there is a rise of anti-Semitism, which we've seen most dramatically in the kind of return of attacks on mosques and on synagogues, congregations, etc. But also that same right is mobilizing anti-Semitism as its own kind of issue to kind of deal with, to attack the left. And that there is a sort of ability by the right to mobilize anti-Semitism, I think, in these kind of for anti-elitist narratives that Barnaby has talked about, while at the same time showing itself as the sort of defender of Jews by fighting an anti-Semitism that is understood as coming primarily from the left on the one hand and from other racialized groups on the other, particularly Muslims, but also, of course, Palestinians, and the kind of broader anti-racist movement in general. And so in that sense, Jews are constructed by a right that is increasingly mobilizing anti-Semitism as sort of standing in direct opposition to the left and needing to be saved by the left. And I think that's quite an odd position to find ourselves in. So you can have Theresa May literally erecting a statue in front of Parliament to a Nazi sympathizer and raving anti-Semite, while at the same time stepping into Parliament the next day to denounce Corbyn and the Labour Party as an existential threat to Jews. You can have the Boris government cozying up to neo-Nazis in Hungary, as well as to the kind of project of unifying the far right by, what's his name, Bannon, while at the same time positioning itself as the defender of Jews in the West. And perhaps most terrifyingly, the leadership of Jewish communities, and I'll come back to that, is prepared to go along with it. And so I think that's quite a difficult situation to be in, and certainly one that's very different. And the argument I want to make is that on the one hand, we're in a situation in which Jews are today racialized no longer as the sort of gravediggers of capitalism as they would have been at the beginning of the 20th century, both from below and from above, right? As the dangerous cosmopolitan capitalists or as the kind of Bolshevik anti-systemic revolutionaries, but instead constructed as both the protectors of a particular vision or image of the Western state and the shield behind which that state can hide when faced with the growing kind of rebellion or opposition by the left and other racialized groups. And that's of course something that puts Jews actually in danger. And I think it's not unconnected. Well, it's not, I think it's unconnected. It's not unconnected that this narrative is so central at a time of growing violence against Jews. And I'll come back to that. And I think there's three elements in how we should think about anti-Semitism that are deeply engaged with or discussed in these debates. One is that I think it's impossible to understand anti-Semitism without putting it in relation with other processes of racialization. And particularly how Jews are constructed today in opposition to other racialized groups. The second one is that I think there is a specific sort of racialization through deracialization, in a sense, that Jews find themselves in today. And so something that Patrick Wolf discusses in his book on Traces of History, on kind of race in colonial situations, where he talks about particular settler colonies in which the settlers, being in minorities, deracialized particular populations in order to set them up as barriers between themselves and the indigenous population. And in that sense, in fact, the position of Jews in North Africa, I think, is really, really useful. I've promised our American comrades an article about this for over a year now, which I promise will be written anytime now if they happen to watch this video. And I don't have the time to get into it now, but perhaps in the discussion I can return to some of that. But so I think this idea of racialization through deracialization is an important one. And the last one is actually to take seriously the class differences inside of the Jewish community itself and the way that they've played a role in that, and how that plays a role in this narrative, which is to say that Finkelstein's particular kind of description of it, as Barnaby says, is pretty appalling, I think. But there is clearly a transformation of the class position overall that Jews occupy in the West in general, which actually has a lot to do with the Holocaust and also a certain class nature of who ends up dying in much larger numbers, as well as the replacement of Jews by new waves of immigration after the Second World War. But also the fact that I think there is a particular role played by the Jewish leadership and bourgeoisie in this story, which remains the case today, right? And Barnaby points to this when he talks about the way in which we talk about in communities, in terms of communities, in a way that's deeply unhelpful, right? Is that the Board of Deputies is much more helpfully understood as David Rosenberg reminds us of repeatedly, is that this is really a Tory organization, right? Is that this is an organization of Tory Jews. And I think is much more helpfully understood in that way. But of course that we are in this kind of situation in which communities are understood as unified, having the same interest, experiences, etc., instead of being driven by class, cultural, religious, political differences, and therefore that different elements within different communities have different interests and of course different power in shaping those interests. So what do I mean by all of those things at the same time? So my kind of the things I've written about anti-Semitism and the way I think about it sort of focuses on the period after the Second World War, in which I think a number of developments transformed the position that Jews occupy in the West. Firstly, there's of course the question of decolonization, the rise of progressive, broadly defined regimes in the global South that make a number of claims towards Western regimes about the transformation of power relations, the need to pay for the damages of colonialism, etc. on the one hand, and on the other hand, certainly threaten the particular domination of the former colonial empires, well, not threatens, but brings down the domination of the former colonial empires across the world, and therefore reshapes in a very radical way international power relations, at the same time as a post-colonial migration from the global South increasingly plays a role as a mass racialized working section of the working class inside of the West. And that double threat to the Western state, both from within and from without, particularly as those populations start rebelling inside of the West as well, is a redefinition of European states' own history through the Holocaust. So in the 1960s and 70s, the approach of Western states, and in fact of Israel at the same time, and I think for very similar reasons, to the Holocaust dramatically changes. And it moves from silence as at best to understanding the Holocaust as a central aspect of European history, to demonstrate through the recognition of the horrors of the Holocaust and the kind of never again slogan of the anti-racist credentials of states who, of course, participated in all sorts of ways, certainly to the build-up towards the Holocaust, and in many ways through non-intervention, through its actual taking place. And that the Holocaust then becomes sort of central in the way that Enzo Traverso describes in the End of Jewish Modernity, to the way the Western state presents itself on the world stage as having this sort of anti-racist credential. And of course, the Holocaust continues to play that role. And so it's a sort of rhetorical recognition that fails absolutely to deal with any of the material bases that made anti-Semitism, the Holocaust, violence against Jews possible. So it's sort of a whitewashing of the state through a particular narrative in which the Holocaust serves as a sort of a defining moment of the horrors of fascism that the kind of liberal state becomes the only barrier to. Which I think needs to be understood in response to this period of decolonization and post-colonial migration. At the same time, Israel also enters definitely the US sphere of influence, and that has a massive role, particularly in the United States, on how Jewish communities are then understood in the US in the same period, in the 1960s and the 1970s, in which as the United States firmly decide on Israel as its key ally in the region, and so that it becomes clear that Israel will not become an ally of the Soviet Union, and that Arab nationalism will not enter in an alliance with the West, that Israel becomes the key defender of Western interests in the Middle East. And while I join Barnaby in the particular critique he made of Norman Finkelstein, I think in his book, Knowing Too Much, he raises or demonstrates really powerfully the fact that the Jewish elites in the United States, and I think you can trace a similar process in Europe, understand Zionism as an opportunity to be integrated inside of the American ruling class in a way that anti-Semitism had previously barred them from doing it, right? So what he describes is that the American Jewish bourgeoisie become Zionist because they are good Americans rather than be Zionist because they are Jews, right? Is that as the United States enter an alliance with Israel, it becomes an opportunity to get closer to a sort of an integrationist dream, which Zionism had, of course, always been, right? When you read Herzl, this is how Herzl talks about Zionism. It's to say we will never be accepted at home, despite the fact that we speak German, we know the German theater and literature, etc., better than the Goyim, they will still not allow us into their circles. And by constructing our own state, we will be integrated into the Western family of nations. And in fact, in the 60s and 70s, that's exactly the ideological role that Zionism plays again for the Jewish leaderships of the key kind of community organizations in the West. And so I think there's a sort of a double question where on the one hand, the Western state starts constructing surviving Jewish populations, particularly in Europe, as the example of its official anti-racism that recognizes the Holocaust, the horrors of fascism, the kind of slogan of never again, while at the same time Jews are constructed both as the defenders of Western civilization's claim about itself at home and as synonym with Zionism and therefore Western interests abroad at the same time. And that this double narrative becomes a way for the Jewish bourgeoisie to integrate itself into the ruling, well, to attempt to integrate itself more fully into the ruling classes in the West. And I think that's important because it means that exactly this shift is operated in the second half of the 20th century that I described before, that the Jew is no longer understood as the gravedigger, the danger, the revolutionary, the cosmopolitan destroyer of the nation state, but on the contrary, becomes constructed as the representative and the defender of the Western nation state against its other threats, which are either threats to imperialism abroad or threats to the state through the mobilizations of post-colonial working classes at home. And so that Jewish populations become very much constructed as a sort of shield behind which the state can hide when it is being challenged on the questions of racism, discrimination, imperialism, etc. And I'll just end by saying that I think this is very visible in the way that policy is developed today. So the IHRA definition is exactly that. What does it do? It does nothing to deal with anti-Semitism, as the Center for Research on Anti-Semitism at Birkbeck pointed out at the time. Unfortunately, many of its members, I think, have made interventions that have been much less useful since. But importantly pointed out that by moving away from defining anti-Semitism as structural, which all other forms of racism have done since the late 1990s, and therefore identify institutional and structural ways in which racism is facilitated, encouraged, and normalized, the HRA goes in the opposite direction, makes it, in the way Barnaby talks, entirely about how individuals behave, and so actually has no teeth to deal with whether or not an institution might have a problem with anti-Semitism, because the definition doesn't allow to identify that. What it does do is that it constructs Jews in direct opposition with Palestinians. You can't do both. You can't fight anti-Semitism and fight the racism of Zionist settler colonialism in Palestine. These are in absolute opposition, and so Jews are constructed in opposition with Palestinians. By extension, the way in which the prevent policy criminalizes anti-imperialism and Palestine solidarity does something very similar with Muslim communities in general, is that these ideas are suspect because they are understood as racist, right? So we know from all the guidelines, prevent guidelines, that Palestine solidarity, critique of Israel, critique of anti-imperialism, etc., are key indicators of so-called non-violent extremism. And in that way in which Jews are made synonymous with Zionism, they are constructed as directly opposed to Muslims through policy. And I think that approach also helps us make sense of the odd kind of situation in which we are today, where you have raving anti-Semites like the Orban government, Trump, much of the right of the Tory party, the old French right, Marine Le Pen, etc., who on the one hand can be raving anti-Semites and on the other hand can position themselves as friends of the Jews, friends of Israel, and actually friends of the Jews because they are friends of Israel, and be welcomed by many of these sort of bourgeois Jewish organizations that then normalize or facilitate their self-presentation as defender of the Jews, which I think was the most disgustingly visible when the head of the equivalent of the Board of Deputies in France gave a speech to say that Marine Le Pen captured importantly the worries of the Jewish community in France by identifying the rising problem that Muslims represented inside of that state. And so the old joke, which has become the sort of go-to for these kind of debates today, that Philo-Semites are anti-Semites who happen to love Jews, I think underestimates the gravity of the problem. Is that not only are they anti-Semites, it's not that they're anti-Semites who love Jews, but that they are anti-Semites who have identified that by hiding behind Jews and the language of anti-Semitism, they can redirect the rage directed at the state for its foreign policy or its racism at home towards another minority that is being presented as integrated and defended, but actually singled out and identified as a sort of shield behind which the state can hide its own racism and policies. And that, I think, captures the new situation we find ourselves in terms of how the state facilitates a new form of anti-Semitism through a language of protecting Jews, which actually does exactly the opposite.
Okay, so Robin says that our arguments are like two barrels of a gun. Now, I am a rootless cosmopolitan with no practical skills, and I'm certainly an effete intellectual with no knowledge of armed struggle. So I have just been engaged with Sai in a furious discussion of trying to work out how guns work. And we believe that guns fire out of both barrels at once. Now, I don't know if that's right, but we're pleased with that as a kind of summary of our position here. So I just want to stress, I want to start, I have too much to say, but I want to start by stressing three kinds of codependence of my argument and Sai's. Sai and I do actually have a disagreement. That I have a response coming out in the next issue of Salvage to his sort of a critique of my position. We have a disagreement about how important is the causal role of the state in producing modern anti-Semitism as he sees it, or merely fueling it as I see it. There is a disagreement between us, but I don't think it's nearly as big a disagreement as some people have been supposing. So I want to just talk about three kinds of codependence first of our arguments. having cleared some of this with Sai. So one is that the kind of subaltern anti-Semitism that I've been discussing is important as the kind of nightmare spectre that can cohere the state philo-Semitism that Sai is discussing, right? So you need the kind of, you need some substance. I mean, Stuart Hall's very clear about this when he talks about moral panics, which is the frame I've sometimes used. You need some substantive phenomenon in order to form the locus for your then crazed pathological kind of panic about it. So that's the first kind of codependence of our argument. Secondly, Sai's argument about a state philo-Semitism and this use that the ruling class and imperialist states find for Jews and for panics about the place of Jews works extremely powerfully and importantly as a response to the kind of subaltern anti-Semitism I'm talking about. Because one of the things that Robin and Simon and others stressed as an example of contemporary anti-Semitism is the ease of saying for some people, oh look, there's this attack on Jeremy Corbyn, oh look, there's an attack on radical politicians all around the world and on the Palestine Solidarity Movement. Who's responsible? It must be the powerful Jews. And I and Sai have both tried to say that there's a important way in which that's wrong, in which this panic isn't really authored by Jews, though some right-wing Jews participate in it, of course, but it's not really authored by Jews and it's not really about helping Jews. It serves completely other agendas. And that's an extremely important piece of kind of left-wing education to give people. When you see all these attacks, this moral panic about anti-Semitism, especially maybe if you're a black person in Britain, you're like, my God, no one cares when I'm arrested and stopped and searched. Everyone cares about the Jews. It must be because the Jews are really powerful and control the media. Sai's argument is very important in providing an alternative analysis to that. That's not the reason at all. It's because Jews serve a function, and that the dishonest claim about protecting Jews serves a function for the reproduction of class society and imperialist society. And then the third respect in which Sai's argument and mine are complementary that I was just discussing with him just now, is that I realize we're both motivated by an attempt to refuse a pervasive logic, which I think is an awful one, which says, let's choose which racism we care about, and which group we care about, which community we care about, this constructed but essentialized term community, and so which anti-racism we prioritize. I care about Islamophobia, you care about anti-Semitism, let's trade off. What's so important is we're both trying to show how different forms of bigotry serve distinctive social functions. You know, so rather than asking what's worse, anti-Semitism or Islamophobia, in my frame, you can do an analysis, and lots of others have done it, of the social role that Islamophobia plays in the reproduction of imperialism, for example. And I'm giving you an analysis of the important social function of subaltern anti-Semitism in producing a form of anti-elitism that is not really radical and a threat to the status quo. These are different functions. So so it's not a question of measuring who you care about more and who's more affected. Clearly, Muslims are dramatically more unsafe and targeted by power in the state in Britain today than Jews. But that's not the kind of terms on which, the only terms at least on which to pose the question. See instead how the distinctive social functions that are served by these different panics and bigotries. And Sai has done the same for the social function of state-led so-called philo-Semitism, really, as he's shown, anti-Semitism. So I want to start with that. Okay, just a few responses to people. To Annie, I just want to highlight further something that Annie said, because I think Annie has pointed out a really striking similarity between contemporary languages of so-called anti-blackness and anti-Semitism, which is the rising contemporary trend of making the villains not a structure of power of something like white society or capitalist society, but instead other minority groups who are seen as sort of benefiting from the few crumbs of anti-racism that there are to go round in a racist society, and so depriving the really deprived groups. So we hear all the language today of South Asian anti-blackness, Arab anti-blackness, and Annie, I think, is interestingly pointed to the parallel between that and the language of Palestinians, Muslims as the real anti-Semites today, or indeed in the contemporary language that's very common and I think offensive. The left cares so much about these other groups, it just doesn't have any time to care about Jews. I think Muslim members of the Labour Party would query that. So I just want to stress that Annie talked about geopolitical shifts as the basis for the increasing difficulties of solidarity, the spread of that kind of fragmented politics. But she's also coming up with a project, I know, and so I just want to flag it, about a kind of class fragmentation as the basis for some of those shifts, about political blackness in Britain as relying on a shared experience of proletarianization that then broke down, and the story of a neoliberal shift in the class position of different ethnic groups as key to the breakdown in a more united anti-racism. And I think that's a very important story that I know Annie's working on and has important parallels to anti-Semitism. So I just want to flag that. Okay, I want to just finish by responding to Bat, who raised, I think, some really, really interesting points at the opening. Before I do, I should say, Simon raises this point that's got me in trouble about me saying I don't think racism is the best language through which to talk about anti-Semitism. I'm not so invested in this. It's just a point about saying that we need careful and subtle ways of thinking about different forms of conservative consciousness. So I say, you know, anti-Semitism might have less in common with white supremacy in the United States racism than it does with conspiracy theories about Freemasons, not racism. So it's not, yeah, as I say, I'm not strongly invested in the question. It's not, I don't say it's not racism because Jews aren't a race or any of those kinds of arguments. I'm not that interested in taking a position on those arguments, but just that the kind of abstraction racism, the kind of block racism as the only way to which we can talk about reactionary forms of antagonistic politics, I think is an impoverished, limiting form. And we should think about anti-Semitism as a form of subaltern, supposedly anti-leastist consciousness without needing to call it racist. I think we need a broader kind of plateau of a sense of what, I don't mean plateau, platter, I don't know, a big plate full of lots of different delights of right-wing antagonistic politics. Okay, I wanted to respond to Bat because I think he makes really, really good and important points. So firstly, he says he thinks that my account and Sai's are to some degree complementary, and I just disagree with the reason that he says they might be complementary. So he says I stress continuities and Sai stresses the changes. I mean, I think most basically, I'm giving a picture of stuff happening from below and Sai's giving a picture of stuff happening from above. And I've actually, in stuff I've written, also talked about the from above quite a lot. But in this presentation, because I knew what Sai would be doing, I was focusing on the from below bit. So I think that's the complementarity, not really that I stress continuities, because my argument is really about the novelty of a post-1989 condition in which the supposed impossibility of social revolution is a condition of possibility for more conservative forms of antagonistic politics. And I think that's very different from a 1930s moment in which those other forms of antagonistic politics come consciously to crush the left. In this moment, they rather arise precisely because of the absence of the left. I've also written about the turn from anti-Semitism as a form of optimism in the 1930s to anti-Semitism as a form of pessimism today. And I think this is a fundamental shift. So once it was, hey, it's great, you can just get rid of the Jews and your society will be fine, you know, in its most brutal form, this is eliminationist Nazi anti-Semitism. Getting rid of this small cancerous outgrowth called the Jews will solve your problems. Now, I think a really rising form that you see all over the internet is actually you can't change anything. You silly lefties who think you can change things, you can't. You're wrong, because they will never let you. And they can sometimes be lizards, and it can sometimes be Jews. And the idea of an omnipotent conspiracy is here rendered as really omnipotent. That is to say, it isn't any longer. It's really reassuring to think there's a conspiracy rather than a structural problem because the conspiracy is more easily vanquished. Instead, the claim is, the fact of there being a conspiracy is more deep than a structural problem. You really can't ever get rid of. So again, I think this is a kind of neoliberal end of history condition. I've called it Panglossian pessimism. You know, Voltaire's Panglossianism is in Conti, we live in the best of all possible worlds. I think we now have Panglossian pessimism. We live in the best of all possible worlds and it is shit. And I think that's the kind of condition that a pessimistic anti-Semitism speaks to. But then Bat says, that there's a kind of elective affinity between conspiratorial thinking and anti-Semitism, and we shouldn't get too carried away with this. And I agree. In its most extreme form, some acolytes of Moshe Stone's kind of argumentation end up saying that Bernie Sanders is anti-Semitic because in talking about only banks and individual bankers as a problem rather than the whole structure of impersonal domination in capitalist society, he's just like, he's not substantively different from an anti-Semite who says the problem is just Jews. Clearly, in talking about 9/11 and the centrality of culturalism to our politics, I've tried to make an argument that it's not enough to focus on conspiratorial aspects as central to anti-Semitism. The crucial logic of anti-Semitism ethnicizes or culturalizes the conspiracy. It says it isn't just that the problem's a few bankers, it's that what those bankers have in common is they're Jews. That's what makes Rothschild or Soros a danger, not the fact that they are bankers, because other bankers are fine. So I agree that we shouldn't get too carried away by the elective affinity between all conspiratorial thinking and anti-Semitism. But I think the fact that theories of cultural Marxism today don't always name Jews risks taking us down some poor thinking in a couple of respects. Firstly, which Robin and Simon have both mentioned, I think we risk underestimating the presence of still live thinking about Jews. I think, from Pittsburgh to Charlottesville to Halle in Germany to Hungary, it's quite clear that there is lots of consciousness around that names Jews as a problem. And given that this form of thinking was originally generated with Jews as its object, what you often see is even if now it resurges without Jews as its conscious initial object, Jews can then become the object later. It's a form of thinking well fitted to then saying, oh, and actually these bankers are Jews. But I don't think that's the only point here. Right? I think that in saying theories of cultural Marxism aren't anti-Semitic anymore because they don't name Jews, we risk one, making ideology something that has to be conscious, and I don't think our ideology does. And secondly, we risk reiterating this mistaken way of thinking about anti-Semitism, where anti-Semitism is a problem for Jews, and therefore it's a problem that affects Jews, and Jews are its only victims. So we get this game, what is and isn't a trope? Is this way of thinking a problem because it refers to Jews or not? Whereas what I've been trying to argue is a theory of a social totality of the kind that Marxism aims to be, and therefore a theory that tries to slot in theories of ideology and the critique of ideology into that theory of social totality, does not ask, is this bigotry a problem because it affects X group, but instead asks, what function does this bigotry serve in the reproduction of the social totality? So that I'm quite fine with the idea that we have today the form of anti-Semitism, not always with the content, though I think that underestimates the frequency of that content, it being about Jews resurfacing. But I absolutely think that part of the necessity of a left-wing critique of anti-Semitism is to understand this form of thinking, which understands the problems of society as conspiratorial ethnic ciphers, and to then see how that form proliferates and reproduces in the way that people talk about Putin in the West today, for example, or increasingly, I think, China, even though they're not talking about Jews. So I think that a critical theory of anti-Semitism should give us the ability to say that. And so I therefore have some sympathy with what Bat says, even though I think he understates the role of conscious targeting of Jews still today. Thanks so much. Sorry for taking up way too much time.
Sorry.
Sorry.
The advantage of you taking so much time is that we're already over time, so there is no longer any limit on how much I get to say.
Yeah, I did that deliberately for you, comrade.
Thank you. I would say, yeah, I think I agree with the tension that Barnaby identified in the debates we had, which I think were the most comradely and polite way of sort of Barnaby accusing me of crude materialism as I accused him of the sort of unrooted idealism. Which might actually be a trope if you think about it. As well as, of course, I think much sharper disagreements on strategic questions that don't necessarily, I think, translate into this kind of conversation. I think perhaps there is a parallel, and I think the disagreement with Barnaby did help me in starting to develop this idea, which was on this question of whether it was possible to separate the question of Palestine solidarity and anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, which I think Barnaby thought it was necessary to try to do in order, for example, to disentangle the imposition of the IHRA definition of saying, on the one hand, we should talk about anti-Semitism, and on the other hand, we should deal with Palestine solidarity, and that I disagreed, because I thought it was a strategic impossibility, but also because of how I developed this kind of analysis, that I think they are serving one and the same purpose, and I'll just come back to that at the end. But I very much agree, I think, in how people have formulated the complementary, I can't say the word, so used to polemic, I can't even say it, complementarity, is that the word? Of the approaches of thinking about below and above at the same time. A couple of things. So in terms of in response to Annie, I certainly didn't mean to say that all the other forms of racism I understood as structural and anti-Semitism as individual. What I pointed to was that the Pearce Institute in Birkbeck wrote a very good report on the IHRA definition at the beginning of this debate, in which they pointed out that institutions have moved to use structural understandings of racism in their internal rules except on anti-Semitism, and so that the IHRA definition was a step in a kind of a different direction. So when all other forms of racism are increasingly, including anti-Semitism, were increasingly being defined within organizations as structural, the IHRA definition took it out of that logic. And so that the Peace Institute raised the alarm about the danger that that would create. And in fact, I think exactly because of what Annie very rightly points out and has discussed very much, is that racism is increasingly understood only as an interpersonal relationship rather than a kind of a structural question. And that when we go down that route, you know, and it's one of the problems on the left, right, is that part of the difficulty to get people to respond to this stuff adequately is because racism is only understood as lived experience and individual, you know, and so then people are like, well, Jews have said this, as if there is this one body of Jews who experience things collectively, yet individually, and if one of them says something, then everybody else must fall silent. I think the question of competition between communities is so incredibly important in how anti-racist movements have been weakened and demobilized, and that in fact the position that Jews have been put in by the state has played an important role in that. So Annie spoke about competition between, for example, Black communities and Muslims, or Palestinians, or I think Jews and Muslims. I think the competition in that sense between both Blacks and Jews and Muslims and Jews is an ongoing aspect of that. So I think in a lot of the US political literature, you find this kind of thing of like, well, look at what the Jews have. You know, the Jews got this, they have these institutions, these groups, this kind of representation, we should get the same. In the UK, I think that stuff is incredibly prevalent amongst the kind of Muslim bourgeoisie. So if you listen to the internal discussions of the Muslim Council of Britain, basically they want to be the Board of Deputies, not recognizing that this is not about strategy, but about the particular kind of position that Jews have been placed in by the British state and the use that that argument plays. So the current kind of stuff around the APPG definition of Islamophobia is exactly this. It's a hope by the kind of Muslim establishment that if they also get their definition, they'll be fine. And that definition, by the way, is total poison. In it, it normalizes the IHRA definition. So the MCB is now going to be used to push forward a normalization of the attacks on Palestine solidarity in exactly this way in which kind of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism play together. And in fact, Wes Streeting chaired the committee that was to come up with that definition. So again, the kind of ways in which these things are connected, I think, is important. Just briefly on what Robin said, I think the question of British imperialism cynically using philo-Semitism around Zionism is crucial. But again, there's a switch here which I think is useful to identify, which is that Zionism was very attractive to European ruling classes in the late 19th and early 20th century, because the idea was we get to get rid of our Jews, right? We don't want the Jews at home and we want to control Palestine. So two birds in one stone. Today, the argument is that Jews at home represent Zionism abroad and therefore can also serve as a kind of a disciplining tool against racialized communities at home. And so the question of North Africa, I'll just say briefly, I agree with the point Miriam made, but I think it's not just about Vichy, it's before. What happens in North Africa, and particularly in Algeria, is that while the indigenous code is implemented on the Muslim majority, Jews are given French citizenship and are taken out of their position of indigenous in order to become French. Now, of course, they never become French. The settlers continuously attack them. Anti-Semitism is, of course, rife in France throughout the kind of late 19th and early 20th century, much more than in other places, in fact. But certainly in the settler colony. So their Frenchness is never real. And in fact, Vichy will take it away. Which is sort of described very powerfully by the Jewish kind of literature of that time. But again, it's this idea of lifting the Jews in a sort of a deracializing move in order to pit them against the indigenous population with terrible consequences, right? Is that effectively Algerian Jewry disappeared with the end of colonization because that bridge was never crossed again. And so they left to France. And in fact, today, increasingly are settling in Palestine, you know, which is a sort of horrible irony of history, as well as the mobilization of Islamophobia in France, much more than anywhere else, continuously ends up targeting Jews, right? So when halal food gets attacked, kosher food gets attacked in the same breath. It happened with the minister recently saying it was separatism to have supermarkets selling halal food, and so that the halal food should be sold in separate shops. But he didn't just say halal, he also attacked kosher food, right? So there's continuously this weird thing where the Jewish establishment in France will support Islamophobia, and it continuously attacks Jews in a whole number of ways. So for example, the attack on religious symbols, I think France is one of the few places where that actually doesn't only target Muslims. It of course primarily targets Muslims, but the kippah gets attacked also in a whole number of ways. Very briefly, about Joe's point about whether it will go away, become less important, what about the shotgun, etc. I don't think it will go away. I think all the signs are that it will intensify. We see everywhere, France, Germany, Belgium, Britain, the United States, Canada, laws either passing or being in the pipeline about criminalizing the BDS movement. Repeatedly, this is being done in the name of protecting Jews. The criminalization of anti-Zionism by Macron as being anti-Semitism. The mobilization of the language of protecting Jews against anti-imperialism and Palestinians in particular is intensifying continuously. And while getting Corbyn's head is a big victory in that process, for both, I think, the Western states and Israel, I think it's just that. It's one victory, and there's a much bigger question, which is the remaining, you know, all the kind of data shows that there remains a general solidarity with Palestinians in the populations in the West that is not going away. And so I think the question for us is very much what to do. And the dramatic outcome of this process, which is of course its main goal, is that after 5 years of both anti-Semitism and Palestine being absolutely at the core of the whole of British political life, the action and activism and organizing on it has, if not virtually disappeared, been massively battered back. And so the question, and I think part of how I was trying to think about developing this analysis, is how do we move forward on both, right? And so, for example, these attacks to state policy, I think are a clear way in which we will need to mobilize, perhaps now that many of our comrades are freed of the shackles of having to worry about the next election, which we all know we're already losing anyway, which Starmer, I think, knows as well, hence his sort of kind of current strategy, that there's definitely a question, I think, about how we rebuild a serious principled solidarity movement with the people of Palestine, their struggle for liberation, but also what that means for our own democratic rights in universities, workplaces, communities, etc. And in fact, I think we continuously miss the boat on going on the offensive around questions of anti-Semitism. The fact, you know, I still think this is insane. Theresa May builds a statue to an actual Nazi sympathizer, and nobody does anything. There are no petitions, no demonstrations. There is no attempt at intervening within the hypocrisy of both the mainstream right-wing Jewish organizations that are prepared to let this go because of their commitment to Zionism on the one hand, and of mainstream political parties on the other, who of course don't care about anti-Semitism at all. That I think there are opportunities to highlight that hypocrisy and try to bring it into the public domain in a way that I think nobody has even really tried in the whole kind of 5 years in which that has been the question, partly because I think everybody pretended it was going to go away at some point. Not only is that not going to happen, I think if Corbyn apologizes, it will be the epitome of the victory of the fact that hoping it would go away was the most appalling of strategies. But it's not going to leave after Corbyn either. There will be other political leaders, other social movements, and that disciplining question is going to keep coming back repeatedly until we defeat it, I think. And for that, we actually need to develop a serious strategy to do so. and the ostrich one isn't one. So maybe the shotgun is better than the ostrich. Maybe that's a good way to think about it.
Jace, I know this is not my right, but I just need to say one thing. I know I'm not allowed to. I'm just going to fucking say it. I'm sorry. Just because I'm so happy with what Sai just said. This is like, I think the main message that I think I want people to get, actually, which is over the last 5 years, we on the British left have been faced with an awful choice, a devil's choice, where we were faced with an aggressively right-wing framing of the problem of anti-Semitism as a problem of excessive radicalism. And under that onslaught, people felt forced to choose between either defensively denying that there was much anti-Semitism because it had been framed as a problem of the left. So if you're a left-winger, you defend yourself by saying, no, anti-Semitism is not really a problem. And there were endless different iterations and versions of that defensiveness. Or agreeing, oh yes, shit, it seems all the evidence suggests there is a problem of anti-Semitism, and so I've had the problem framed for me in these right-wing terms, and so we must adopt mechanisms to combat this rising problem, which are right-wing mechanisms that would shut down solidarity with Palestine, and also, in fact, anti-capitalism, as one Labour MP once said, necessarily anti-Semitic. This is the awful choice that both Sai and I think, have been trying to resist, to demand instead that we have genuinely left-wing theories of rising anti-Semitism that are more confident and that don't force us into that choice, because that choice has produced a situation where not only have we failed to take seriously the problem of rising anti-Semitism, but as Sai says, we also in this defensive position have done, I think, a quite unacceptable thing in reducing arguments about solidarity with Palestine to an inane argument about free speech on Israel and the right of Labour Party members to write tweets criticizing the state of Israel without being disciplined, which has become an overwhelmingly defensive thing, where instead we should be assertive and proud about both our anti-racist politics of analysing and challenging and fighting anti-Semitism and our anti-racist politics of championing the liberation of the Palestinian people. And that coexistence, I think, has been lost. And to get it back, we need genuinely left-wing theories of both anti-Semitism and settler colonialism.
Thank you both so much. That was so brilliant, and it's been a really good, stimulating talk. Particularly because it captures something that we've been talking about for so long, which is anti-racism as well as Corbyn. So it's like a perfect kind of meeting of the two. So yeah, thanks so much. And good luck to Jonas for editing all of this. Bye everyone.